or a design where you have a series of items and they are separated by a line in between those items. And in this particular idea, if I resize out, we still get that concept. If we resize down, the items just stack. And so I was looking at using grid layout to actually accomplish this, and it gets me most of the way there. So in this case, if I just resize this out so we can see this a little bit more easily, we have our grid template columns. In this case, I'm going to say repeat, and an auto fit basically means fit as many items in a row as you can based on the dimensions that I've given. In this case, I've got a min-max command that says minimum 300 pixels, but otherwise distribute the size equally amongst them if we've got a little bit more room. Now, I create a grid gap of 1 pixel between each of the items, so that creates that little gap in between each of those things. And of course, the background color gray. So that divider is essentially the background color to the grid itself, and the grid gap creates the space in order for that to shine through. But as you might imagine, so let's say I resize this out a little bit further, we get to a point where, here we go. No longer do we have sort of an even division of items. And since there's nothing to fill these gaps, we just see the background color gray come in. So that's obviously less than ideal. And I've been trying a bunch of different ideas on here. Like I said, like what if we took the last child and we just said like grid column end, and I just do -1. Well, the problem is that it ends at -1, but the actual item itself is still only one grid cell, essentially in width. So it's going from one grid line to the next, and that obviously doesn't quite get me what I want. I suppose I could use media queries in such a way to say that, like, once I've reached above a certain size, that this particular item should be the full width. I mean, if I resize this out completely and I get everything onto, let me just delete this, onto one line, you can see again, I'm back to where I want to be. But this is obviously very dependent as well from a design perspective to the fact that I've got 6 items and there are certain cases where, this does what I want it to do. So for example, if I say, I'm going to constrain the width of my grid to, let's say 1200 pixels, I think is what I want. So yeah, so 1200 pixels gives me my 3 items maxed out, basically. So 1200 pixels, the reason why, if you're saying like 1200 divided by 300, shouldn't that give you 4 columns? But because I've got this grid gap of 1 pixel, that essentially means I need to get to 1200 plus 1, 2, and probably a third here in order to get that. So I probably need to be at a width of 1204 pixels to actually maximize this out. But again, we kind of run into some weird things as well. If I say, like, what if I wanted to center this? So I'm going to use some margin auto, but then I run into some weird things where, due to rounding errors, right? Like you can see that one little line popping up that shouldn't pop up. Yeah, that's not good, due to sort of weird rounding errors that only seem to happen when you're trying to center an item as opposed to left align an item. So that's not great. And of course, again, if I have only 5 items, well, then I'm always going to have that regardless of how many items I have, because, if I, get rid of my width here, that, that I've always got that sort of mismatched item, and I'm always going to have that background. And I couldn't think of a way to actually pull that off. But I do like the idea of this kind of design. And I know on Twitter I've seen people mention, that they wish they could say, like, can I get a grid cell or grid area to essentially have a background color. So I know that idea has been requested. Such a thing doesn't exist, and I haven't found a way, and I don't believe it exists, to be able to say for a grid item to just sort of like, can you fill the remaining amount of space that I have within a particular grid row, which again would be useful. So like, from what I've been able to deduce looking through the spec and all the examples is that you can specify how many lines essentially an element should span, but it is you can't have it sort of dynamically resize the number of lines that it can span, which is a little frustrating. So I am kind of left with here. I would love to throw this idea out and see if any of you can take this a little bit further. So thank you very much. Have a good day.